So with that, I want to transition to, so what is the point of integration? And as both Carrie and Karan mentioned, it's data. And data is arguably the most strategic asset that institutions have to date. I think it's not an exaggeration to say increasingly there's a realization that the applications, the enterprise applications we've all been building and managing for the last few decades are really becoming something that is simply in service of putting the data somewhere that can then be acted upon. So with that starting point, I want to bring in Linda Feng from Unicon. I'd encourage Carrie and Karan to stay on because who knows where this discussion is going to go. Thanks for joining us, Linda. So let's get started. I think the way it's categorized, it has been on the corporate side, and now going into education, the data estate. And if you could just spend a minute describing how the data estate differs in a way of approaching this or thinking about it from what I think of as just this collection of data repositories that exist across most campuses.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And hi, everyone. Good to be here. So I think the idea of the data estate for me anyway, has been a term that I've started hearing more recently. But I think it's really about recognizing that there isn't just one kind of data size that fits all. I think for a long time there was this debate, what type of data container is the right one? Is the data warehouse, the data lake, the data mart? People were like, how about the lake house? So I think this is where I think we have collectively started to recognize that with some of the new trends that are happening with different ways that you can think about collecting your data and then having streamlined ways to scale the ingestion and most of the kind of cleaning and organizing that you would do, that you can then use it to serve up multiple kind of downstream consumers and think more in terms of creating more or less a data pipeline that is fundamentally driven by some sort of, I'll just call it a pool of data that is going through various stages. And we think back to, I remember when the data warehouse came about, it was really when there were kind of centralized relational databases. We had business event data from different sources. People were talking about that time, OLAP and analytics, business intelligence. That was all okay at the time because you could essentially mount large, expensive type, rack databases, Teradata, things like that, just to handle load. You needed to do things like the kind of OLAP cubes and so on, back in the day. But when the World Wide Web exploded, now you have enterprises that potentially had millions of users generating millions of business events. And now even the most powerful data warehouse products couldn't really keep up with that load. So they were thinking of creative ways to figure out how to traverse all the data. And that's where the Apache Hadoop distributed file system came about. And that file system architecture really gave you the ability to handle the terabytes of the raw business event data. And because it was no longer practical to just run queries on all of that data, that's when they came up with the MapReduce type technology. So you can summarize, reduce it into smaller sets, and then have distributed queries that go after all of your data sets and then aggregate them. So that's how the idea of being able to have a warehouse that's really kind of broken out into different data marts, was really the way of thinking of how to handle this type of scale. And then finally, they kind of came up with the term data lake because you needed a way to store all that raw enterprise data in the HDFS storage and all the other hosted file systems. And later now in the cloud storage, so S3 and Google Cloud and Azure. So that's how the terms that we're familiar with now have really evolved because of the changing dynamic of how much data we're producing and the expectations for the ways in which we want to actually utilize and look at different kinds of data. So
Okay.
the idea of the data lake is that it's flexible enough. You can get the structured and unstructured data together, and you can have you don't have to worry about every time some consumer needs a different kind of data, do you have to go pulling a whole another copy of your source data and figuring out how to ingest it? You can just do that once. And you can have better governance because you can make rules about how you're going to get it from the source, clean it, organize it, figure out how it's going to be anonymized if that's the need. And so that's really the approach I think that we're coming to now with this modern data lake, modern data estate.
Well, and so we went down the road with the data lake, and you've developed an online course about building and operating a data lake. So you threw some terms out there that I think for some folks on this call probably sound intimidating or something that only makes sense to a data scientist. I think increasingly that's a dangerous perspective to have. Nonetheless, can you demystify the data lake a little bit? Like how do you get started? How to think about it, some do's and don'ts in the perspective of people that particularly that are trying to solve a business problem or deliver a service.
Yeah, absolutely. So I put together the online course. It takes people through kind of what I've seen as the 5 steps that most data lake type projects tend to have. And we start from kind of step 1 really being identifying your data source, to ingestion, and then cleaning and organizing, and then finally to visualizing. And each step we really talk about what are those considerations, the pitfalls, and then the different techniques. And so like one of the do's in the kind of idea of do's and don'ts is, and it applies to, I think, any of us here, is think about the questions you want to ask of your data. What are some of the most important answers that stakeholders are going to be looking for? And at the same time, I think you don't want to feel like you have to imagine the exhaustive list of all the questions before you even collect the first piece of data. What I counsel people, I think Dr. Kesar said this morning that while you see a lot of diagrams that kind of look like things are step by step, I mean, many times the process is iterative. So even though you might see that, you got to do step 1 before you can do step 2, what we try to tell people, and what I've seen works well, is when people think of what is that thinnest slice, and let's try to see if we can imagine just a very basic, I think Carrie talked about, usage. People just want to know, what parts of my LMS today are being utilized. Let me go try to do some counts to figure that out. So that's a relatively straightforward kind of query. We can map that back to the kinds of data that we need, and then we can build out our pipeline just to support that. The other thing too is, don't feel like you need to have a reason to store all of the data. The advantage of the kind of the data lake architecture is you can collect the structured and the unstructured data over time. Today, you might feel like you have a need to answer some question with half your data, but maybe tomorrow there's new questions that might arise, and you might realize, hey, it's a good thing I went and collected all that data because I could actually use it now for a different purpose. That I think is what people find very, very flexible about the approach that today we just allow with the data lake architecture. The other thing too is to not be afraid to refactor. I think if you're at this, you're going to find that not only your infrastructure but also your processes might need tweaking along the way, and that's all okay, and it's part of the learning process. I think that different teams that I've worked with have actually started to embrace the idea that They first started out, thinking more kind of waterfally, and later, have moved now to a more agile, let's kind of see where this takes us. I often say, when building these things, it's like I could imagine, I don't know, the piece of clothing that I might want, but until I see it in the store or see it, coming down the runway, somehow I don't actually realize until I see something what really is, the need that I have. So those are some of the do's and don'ts, I think, that we talk about.
Okay, I think we got a couple of questions in the group here.
I have a question. I'm much more functional than technical, but I'm kind of nerding out on this a little bit. Kind of cool because you're kind of making it simple for me to understand. So as you guys may know, I work on smart campus kind of stuff, right? And smart campus is about using data from all these different sources, right? But they're collecting it from a camera to parking lots to libraries, like you name it, it's all coming in. Right now, they're not in a lake, right? They're all in these separate, so I was with the president just a couple days ago, and her question to me is, Matt, how do we become a real-time on-demand support institution? So we're now addressing that to her. How do we address it? The first thing I said to her is, you need your data sources all to be collected in one central area that has some logic and decisions based on what you need, meaning your presidents of your campuses are going to need something, your directors of these offices are going to need something, your CIO. And I'll be honest, the past 5 years, there's been a lot of, I'm going to have lakes all over the place. Every vendor will tell you I have a data lake. They're all little data ponds at this stage. How do we get this ecosystem? Because it's definitely needed, because the presidents are saying, man, I need dashboards so I can make better analytics. My ERP is gathering a lot of data. We don't know what my wait list is. Like the most common basic things they're not able to do because it's not connecting anyone together. How do you guide that process? And maybe this is an offline between you and me discussion, but I'd love to understand it, because if my presidents are asking me this, I need the answer to be able to say, these are the 5 things we should do together in the next 6 months.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I sometimes talk about data eddies. So I think there are interesting ways that because if you think about a campus and their mission critical systems, you will find that there are kind of pools of data that are relevant, that have to do with that application, that most likely are co-located with that application. And that's okay to, I think, initially think of, well, I have one application that's primarily generating, I don't know, like, financial aid data or housing data or something. And what are the questions that make sense to have answered about that? And if we then reach kind of a certain stage of maturity, then I think we start thinking about connecting between these pillars or mission critical applications. And that's where, as long as it requires a certain maturity, because you need to be able to say, oh, I have user identifiers that are consistent, I have courses, or I have certain key contextual dimensional information that we agree, I think UCSD is a great example. They've got a lot of good data initiatives underway, and they've been at it for a while. And one of their biggest, I think, breakthroughs is that they've come up with a decent system for their governance. And I think I've heard them say things like, we spend a lot of time just sitting around a table and trying to argue over what is a freshman. So things like that are going to be very important. And if you're going to try to join or marry data across systems that you have on your campus, in order to bring that kind of value that you're talking about, Matt. And I feel that I often am in the room where there are the kinds of stakeholders sit together, and most of the technical folks pretty much are like, well, we can build something, we just need to know what to build for. And then we have other parts that are kind of maybe unit owners that are like, well, I just want kind of my like, unit level kind of information. And it really takes some, I guess, elevated types of questions and the kind of leadership that, some of the schools are definitely moving towards that, but it really does take, the kinds of questions that say, I want to know, I don't know, like, where my students are, are finding the best use of their, I don't know, their parking pass or something when they get to campus. The one example that I love to cite is one school that I know was trying to find out what time of day students were turning in assignments. And because they were using online systems like Canvas, they had a way to visualize assignment submissions by time of day. They could create kind of like a heat map. And they saw the spike, right before the assignments due, then they saw the trickle right after, and then the steep drop off, which is pretty predictable. But what surprised them was that they also realized that the assignment due dates, it kind of was arbitrary. The professors would, might have set it to be like 7 a.m. or, sometime between midnight and 8 a.m. And when that was happening, the students were basically pulling all-nighters and working on the assignments through the night, just so that they could get it in like by the 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. deadline. And once they figured this out, they could tell professors, just make your assignments due like before midnight. And that really changed the dynamic of how the students were getting their work done on the days that the assignments were due.
Interesting. So yeah. I see Steve is up, but Rodney, I know, hasn't asked a question. Rodney, do you want to ask your question really quick?
As quick as I can. It seems that our campuses are data rich and information poor, that the data has been captured for the last 20 years, but no one seems to know that it's available or even how to use it. And it seems to me that it's a people issue in the consumption of the data, and how do we get the right people in the right place on our campuses to search out the information, start using it, and making the decisions that need to be made?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things is really with community. Mitchell Culver is someone that I've been working with, and he's at Utah State. He has a fun term that he coined, I think, which was that, when there are data initiatives at an institution, there needs to also be kind of a data therapist. So you need to be able to help people who are interacting with the data to say, how do you feel about the information that you're seeing? And, I think that goes to not more than just kind of training, but really internalization. And how do you do you have kind of like, you throw it over, some group has kind of made a bunch of charts and reports and then just throws it over the wall, and then here you go, here's what you're supposed to, who knows what you're supposed to do with it at that point. So then there's like a lot of mistrust, and I feel that kind of personal interaction is going to be more important than ever.
Georgia has also asked, I think, an interesting question here in the chat is, what is the impact of iPads definition on the campuses being able to analyze their data? The example that she cites is a great one, first time, full-time definition. Is that still a relevant definition, and are some of these outdated definitions, are they handcuffing us, is how I'm interpreting the question.
Yeah, I think that is related to something that I read recently about some legislation, I think, that is trying to build kind of this web page where students can go and immediately kind of see all these statistics about the institution that they might be interested in. And there's concerns about data collection, at the personal level. Supposedly it's going to be anonymized, but I think people still have that. Is this really need, data, is the data really minimized enough so that only, I don't know, to support the statistics is, or if you minimize it too much, do the statistics become meaningless? And I feel that there are some good efforts to try to put stakes in the ground about, here are definitions of first time, full time, and so on. I do feel that universities may still have nuances there, so it still may not apply. So I guess I worry a little bit about, we have to find that balance between, having ways to define things, for the benefit of cross institutional views, but also making sure that the metrics then have meaning for within an institution.
So Linda and Steve, I know you want to go. I just want to ask just one question. I apologize. So Linda, all these systems that come together, they're all somewhat siloedly designed, right? There's people that go and design a version. So their definition of a student is this, a definition on a CRM is this, on ERP is this. How do they design this more? Does the data lake come first and then these systems that are going to be adopted? Or how do you manage the different definitions of what a first-time college student is, or whatever the definitions those attributes are holding for those respective systems?
Yeah, I think I kind of view it as kind of back to the plumbing analogy. I mean, there's a lot of information you can gather kind of at that raw signal level, and I think it's okay, nowadays with all the kind of advancements now with scalable, infrastructure, we can be very forgiving about what what's there. Just bring it all in, take everything. But then you have to be able to apply some either heuristics or ways to say, oh, this pattern of activity actually represents a student who is submitting a test, and they were working, from home, and maybe there's some other characteristics that you care about. I know that actually there's going to be some discussions to think about those kind of downstream applications and what might, if you kind of had a way to correlate or sort of consolidate your data and apply some of those university specific definitions on it, then I think it enables, like, I think coming up, there's going to be discourse analytics with their nudge stuff, which I'm really excited to hear about. And then there's the get set, some student community stuff. Those are the kinds of things we need to enable. But, knowing that there's iterative work that a school can do to kind of get their foundation around the data sets and how they're going to actually interpret that data, based on, I think, first things first, just do we have the people in there? Do we know kind of, what academic, where do they fit in with the institution from an academic perspective? I think, want to know something about what their goals are so that we can then look at whether the ways in which the university is seeing them through their data is aligned with what their goals are. So I feel like that's kind of that holy trinity is, the person, their goal, and then what they're actually doing with the university.
Sounds good. Hey, Steve, I think you get the award for being the most patient. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, no worries. It plays into so much of what's been said since I've been waiting. So this is terrific, Matt. It's good timing. So much of what Linda's sharing, and Matt, in the case of being asked to help with the president of the university, it really falls around data governance. Okay, so data governance is such a key thing to get right and such a hard thing to take on. because it involves people, it involves process, it involves technology. And a lot of people are guarded and want to keep it close to the vest. They want to hug their data, so to speak. Ultimately, it's in the best interest of all to get through that as quickly and efficiently. Otherwise, you just lose tons of time. You could lose months, if not years, over this. And I bring it up because it's probably the biggest obstacle of them all, right? And so when you talk to a president and they want to try to become, agile, so to speak, what you can't boil the ocean. What I would recommend doing is, prioritize. Let's prioritize. Let's pick one, okay, and let's prove the concept. Find something low-hanging fruit and prove the concept, and all of a sudden, these people will realize and gain confidence that this can happen. It can be done, and now you just can apply that same logic onto the larger, more sophisticated challenges that you're going to deal with. But at least get that win under your belt. So that's one thing I'd recommend. But to your point, Linda, when you mentioned, I loved it, what is a freshman? That's true for every functional question. So in the world of HR, how do you define headcount? And I'm telling you, in higher ed or any bit, you could pontificate on that for months and not come to an agreement. So this is such, and the reason I bring this up is because this is what costs you money. What I mean is, and I don't mean any disrespect to any consultants because it's not where this is coming from. But
Hey,
before
stop
you
talking about us. Stop talking about us, Steve. Like, we have many consultants that are really powerful ambassadors. No, just I
No.
get these things.
The consultants will appreciate this, but before you bring on, I'll label it an expensive consultant. It doesn't mean that they're expensive, but my point is you're paying someone. If you don't have your ducks in a row and didn't define your headcount, you already have them in-house. And you got to now figure that out. And that slows everything up. Whereas when you're engaging in this type of activity, it's important to ask the consultants, what are the kind of questions you need to have? So we have our ducks in a row. There's with any agreement, I always wanted to know what they're going to deliver and what are you expecting us to deliver? Because if you know you can deliver, then you're in a good place. But if you know you have to figure out that headcount question, you may want to start 3, 5, 6 months later, depending on how long it takes you to get through it, or it's just going to cost you more money to answer the same question. I mean, Linda, I'm just curious as to your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the, I think a lot about kind of the idea of like tiny habits and, how can you build confidence by doing something small before you, try to impose kind of some large structured, process on yourself. And really, if you try to do it the other way, I think you wouldn't get the buy-in and people wouldn't understand why it was needed. A school that I'm working with right now, has been had started small and has been able to build on the early work that they did, which, we kind of emphasize, that's the MVP, we'll don't worry about it being perfect, and are just now getting to the point where they can start thinking about, well, what are the rules we want to put into these, repeated metrics that we are trying to calculate. Initially, it was okay to just kind of have ad hoc, well, this guy just figured out that was going to be the calculation for number of active courses or something, right? So it's okay to start with a kind of do what you need to get that first piece done, and then realize later, oh, this is the part that I need to actually quantify and rulify, if that's a word, but because that's when people will understand and get on board with the need for that rule.
Yeah, and just one last thing, back to Rodney's question originally, and Rodney labeled it a people problem. I would just use the term, it's an awareness problem, right? So like any of this is a form of change. Okay, and in a form of change, you need to have those communication mechanisms in place where if this is led centrally, I'm not saying it is, but in a case where it's led centrally, where you can take this information centrally and disseminate it through all your schools and have that feedback loop to get information back. So this way, everyone's on the same page. So this is more about awareness. And anytime you're dealing with data and reporting, who needs to know? So this is all about who needs to know what information. They need to understand what it's about. They need to understand it's accurate. They need to be able to trust it. They need to understand how to get at it. I mean, it's all of that, but that's more about awareness, which is, so don't forget about the world of change management with any of this. that's going to be the difference of success or failure as well.
So I'm going to take a page from Matt's book and get us on track here. But I do want to say, so Linda has authored a chapter in an upcoming EDUCAUSE publication. I think it's in the Quiller. So please look for that.